They talk about the failure of socialism, but where is the success of capitalism in Africa, Asia, and Latin America? Fidel Castro, speaking of remarks made by the U.S. government.
Sin sospechar que en la sierra se alumbraba el porvenir y seguir de modo cruel.
Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution he led were profoundly shaped by the relationship to the United States. From his early enthusiasm for and then disappointment with U.S. involvement in his country, to the implacable opposition of the U.S. government, which pushed his revolution into authoritarianism and poverty. Fidel Alejandro Castro was born on August 13, 1926, to Angel Castro and Lena Gonzalez on his family's sugar plantation in Baran, Cuba. From an early age, Castro showed signs of sympathy for the working class that would eventually motivate his political ambitions. When Fidel was 13, he organized workers into a strike on his father's sugar plantation.
Fidel had a tremendous admiration for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had written Franklin Delano Roosevelt a letter when he was 12, which is discovered at the U.S. National Archive and is on display in Cuba's U.S. interest section, which would be more or less the equivalent of the U.S. Embassy today in Cuba. And in that letter, he offers to personally guide FDR on tours of Oriente, his home province, on tours of Oriente's mines and its great wealth.
FDR never responded, much to Fidel's disappointment. Fidel was privately tutored after grammar school and attended prestigious Catholic boys' academies through high school. He entered law school in late 1945 and there began his lifelong engagement with politics. As a law student, Fidel became aware of the American government's deep involvement in Cuban politics, especially through men like Fulgencio Batista, a military general allegedly paid by the CIA to protect U.S. interests on the island. Starting in 1933, Batista controlled 7 Cuban presidents in succession before being elected to the post himself in 1940. In 1951, Fidel married Martia Balart Diaz, a member of the Cuban aristocracy. The Diaz family's wealthy lifestyle convinced Fidel that American capitalism served only a few of Cuba's most powerful citizens. After this realization, Fidel ran for office as an opposition candidate for the Cuban parliament in 1952. But Batista, after having lost 2 successive presidential races, launched a nonviolent coup and took over Cuba weeks before the election. After the coup, Fidel left his wife and child, and in 1953 he began an anti-Batista underground revolution with his youngest brother Raul Castro. On the 26th of July 1953, Fidel, Raul, and 120 rebels audaciously attacked Moncada Barracks, the second largest barracks in Cuba, filled with nearly 400 Batista soldiers. Half of Fidel's rebels were killed in the ensuing gunfight. The rest were either shot trying to flee or captured after 4 days hiding out in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Of these, all were executed except Fidel, Raul, and 6 others, who were sentenced to 15 years in prison. After only 2 years, Batista, afraid of the support and public protest that Fidel was rallying from prison, exiled the rebels to Mexico. In Mexico, Fidel met Ernesto Che Guevara.
Castro was more a pragmatist, particularly his brother Raul. On the other hand, Guevara was very much an idealist, if not an ideologue. Most accounts, if you look back into the scholarship on Castro and what Castro associates have said, is that Guevara was really the person that pushed Castro along ideologically. In other words, he's the one that, in a sense, supplied the belief system, their values and beliefs, for the revolution.
And with Raul, they started the 26th of July movement, a guerrilla force in honor of the men who died at Moncada. They returned to Cuba with 82 soldiers in a run-down old fishing yacht, famously called Grandma. Landing in Cuba on December 2, 1956, they headed again for the Sierra Maestra Mountains, but were attacked by Batista soldiers along the way. Only Raul, Che, Fidel, and 20 others made it to the mountains alive. In the mountains, Fidel regrouped and began his guerrilla war. He began using the media to his advantage in mid-1957 when a New York Times reporter came to the mountains to talk to him. With this interview, Fidel won the hearts of many Americans, but also scared the American government. In May 1958, with the aid of American extreme artillery such as tanks and jets, Batista launched Operation Verano to crush Fidel Castro. Fidel's forces easily destroyed or captured the tanks, which were crippled by the mountainous terrain. The rebels downed the jets with anti-aircraft guns obtained from American military suppliers who sympathized with their cause. Fidel had other such supporters operating underground inside Cuban cities. After the failure of Operation Verano, Fidel's growing forces began to sweep through Cuba and crush Batista's forces. When Fidel Castro won Santa Clara and the U.S. withdrew its support of Batista, Batista fled the country in the early hours of January 1, 1959. On January 8, 1959, Fidel Castro became Prime Minister of Cuba. His first popularly supported act was to order the execution by firing squad of all men who actively worked for Batista. This move began to alienate the U.S., which saw the mass shootings as the work of an authoritarian dictator. When Fidel nationalized factories, plantations, and private property, he ended U.S. economic dominance of the island. This, along with Fidel's close ties to the Soviet Union, caused tension between the U.S. and Cuba. On January 13, 1961, Washington broke off diplomatic ties with Cuba. This, in itself, did not worry Fidel, who despised U.S. hypocrisy about its own social inequities. Just 2 days later, however, CIA-trained Cubans tried to take the island's Bay of Pigs. They failed, and Fidel's forces killed or captured every enemy attacker. Fidel hailed this victory as a testament to the bravery of the true Cuban people, and public confidence in his regime soared. In 1962, Fidel accepted nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. He feared that without nuclear warheads, nothing would stop the U.S. from invading his country again. In retaliation, the U.S. quarantined Cuba. On October 28, 1962, the Soviet Union relented and announced that it would pull out its warheads from the island, but the U.S. refused to lift its embargo. The Cuban economy began to plummet. While the embargo contributed to the country's hardship, Fidel's leadership was also a factor. Fidel, though a great military leader, never managed his country as successfully as his revolution. He bungled agricultural planning, and his communist-based economy prohibited much-needed imports. In a bid to relieve some of the country's social problems, Fidel Castro began to let Cubans leave his country in 1980. Since then, hundreds of thousands of Cubans have immigrated to more prosperous countries.
Fidel Castro said, okay, we're getting, rid of all the criminals, right? We're going to open our islands and you can take them, you imperialists, right? And we're getting rid of the gays as well. So, this notion of departure is seen as betrayal, right? And betrayal can be seen as, betraying the nation, betraying the man.
Since 2006, due to Fidel's failing health, Raul Castro has gradually taken control of running the Cuban state. This change, combined with the change in administration in Washington, D.C. in November 2008, bodes well for the reopening of economic and political relations between the U.S. and Cuba. Fidel's lasting legacy can be seen in the vast improvement of the health and literacy of the Cuban people, and in the inspiration that he gave to national liberation struggles around the world. Although his revolution devolved into poverty and authoritarianism, he will be remembered for his bravery and determination in the face of the most powerful country in the world. I did what was necessary to keep my revolution alive and to protect my people from capitalism and the return of someone like Batista. Even if I were the last man left fighting for my revolution, I would continue on, because it is what needs to be done.
First of all, my impression of him is that he is, or was, a very charismatic, very charming person, a force of nature. It's no wonder that he led a revolution. It's no wonder he stayed in power as long as he has in Cuba. He's an amazing human being.
From early childhood, Fidel Castro was deeply influenced by his perception of and interactions with the United States. As a fervent patriot, he rebelled against U.S. involvement in Cuban affairs while skillfully deploying American support for his cause. Despite his failings as a head of state, his vision and bravery in defending the Cuban people from exploitation and occupation will define his legacy as a revolutionary.
El problema no es repetir el ayer como fórmula para salvarse. El